Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining this IGC webinar to talk about the new frontiers in urban economic research for developing countries. By way of introduction, I'm Victoria Delbridge, and I head up the International Growth Centre's Cities That Work initiative and will be moderating today's discussion. For those of you who don't know, at the IGC, we work with policymakers in developing countries to promote inclusive and sustainable growth through path-breaking research. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. And I just wanted to say at the outset, there may have been some confusion with times of this webinar, but we will be running for the full hour. You'll all be in different time zones, but from now for the next hour. In terms of housekeeping, all attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. We are also recording today's session, and a video and audio recording will be made available on IGC's website. I'd also like to point out that there will be a brief survey immediately following today's presentation. So if you could please take a minute to fill that out, that would be wonderful, as the feedback really helps us to improve our future events. We're also going to have a designated time to ask questions at the end of the discussion. Please do type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And we'd really like you to submit them at any point during the discussion. We really want this to be interactive, hear from you, and get your sort of thoughts and questions through to the panelists. I think you should be able to pop them in the Q&A or raise your hand if you'd like to come in verbally. So either approach would be fine with us. Finally, there will be links to various papers, videos, and forthcoming calls for both papers for a conference and proposals for funding that will be coming through in the chat. So please do keep an eye out for that. And yeah, I think that is all in terms of the housekeeping. So straight on to today's session. The motivation was really the increasing importance of urban issues in developing countries. As we all know, urbanization is happening at an extremely rapid pace, particularly in Africa and South Asia. And the climate crisis is only really adding to the complexity of these challenges. We as IGC really want to ensure, one, that we have more economists contributing meaningfully to this literature and to the global debate on this, and two, that the evidence produced is actually useful for and reaching those that are making the critical decisions about the future of cities. So to discuss how this literature has evolved and where it is going, I'd like to welcome our two speakers for today. So first is Gilles Duranton, Professor of Real Estate at Wharton, and among other things, co-editor of the Journal of Urban Economics. As many of you will already have seen, Gilles presented on this topic at the last Urbanization and Poverty Reduction Conference at the World Bank, which in many ways motivated this session as well. If you haven't seen it already, we should be posting it in the chat shortly, and I encourage you to watch the video afterwards as well. We're also joined by Bryan, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at the London School of Economics, and also Research Program Director for IGC's Cities Program. Gharad is also the lead author of our forthcoming evidence paper on cities in developing countries, which I'll hope he'll say a little bit more about in the discussion. But with that, to kick us off, I've got a very broad framing question for both of our panelists. Why should economists study developing country cities? Gilles, over to you.
Vicky. So happy to be here and to see people joining in. To start, I think I'd like to talk about a little bit of the context, the academic context we're in here, because there's lots of stuff happening in the world, including those really strong trends towards urbanization. It's not only about people moving to cities, but it's also in those cities and what next. Many places in Latin America where I'm more active tend to be already well urbanized, but at the same time, the cities to a large extent remain to be built. So there's this whole set of actions and really interesting set of issues that are really, really important. And we're coming to it from two different angles. You have traditional well-development economics, which was mostly rural until quite recently, and now realizing, okay, there's lots of stuff happening in cities, we need to do more work there, and they're moving to cities. And urban economists who for many years were more interested in places where we had data, that was North America, that was Europe, and doing our urban stuff, and and actually gaining importance and numbers, and our conferences were getting well ever bigger, and people saying, okay, we also need to think more about what's going on in the developing world. There were some clear data barriers because all the data sets we were using for richer countries were not available. So we are coming from also different set of questions, very different set of angles, and you have those two different fields of economics. I think Gharad will expand on that, but they're approaching the questions very differently. We have a lot to learn and to gain working from each other, but having been to a number of conferences where we try to bring the two groups, the dialogue is difficult. We have very different cultures, we have very different approaches, ranging from the sort, like urban economics is interested in those middle objects, which are cities, which are not quite micro, nor completely macro. And what we're seeing in development economics is that the bulk of development is a lot more micro than we are. People doing our cities on very specific and narrow questions. And at the same time, there's also another branch of development, which is more like macro development, which is at a higher level of aggregation. And urban is sort of squeezed in between the two. And we have some difficulties having those three levels actually talking to each other in a more productive way. Then the second issue, which, there's lots of areas where there's essentially no academic literature. These are like first order issues. Housing finance. People typically do not have enough in their pockets to actually buy a house anew. And here we are. Even in our world here in richer countries, there's a whole system of mortgage finance, blah, 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 and a very large literature that studies well those things in real estate, in finance, in some parts of economics as well. And if you go to developing countries, I don't know, or there's barely any academic literature. It's very, very far. And actually, most of the knowledge on that topic and many others is actually coming from people who are around academia, but they're not like writing academic papers. They're more like research / consultants / practitioners. And they're actually the people who are the real experts who know stuff. And at some level, that's a sad state of affairs. These people are really important and needed, but like in a normal world, there would be some crystallized knowledge will coming from academia. And as far as I can tell, yes, on issues of urban transportation in developing countries, urban planning in developing countries, housing finance, and so on and so forth, there's really very, very little in terms of academic literature relative to the importance of those topics in the life of these people living in the cities.
Great. Thanks so much, Gilles. I think that's over to Gharad to add his thoughts as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for those intros, Vicky, and thanks for that, Gilles. So I guess the question is, why should you study why should we be studying urban economics in developing countries? So I want to give you a few good reasons to start, and then I'm going to give a description of what I think that research might look like. So first of all, the IGC has a call for proposals coming up, and there'll be money to go towards research in developing countries around cities. And so that's a good opportunity for people to fund things, and therefore a good opportunity to work in this environment. The second is, of course, that we have really great questions. And I'm going to agree with Gilles here that oftentimes we have no good answers to these really great questions. And sometimes we don't even have literatures. The number of answers that we have become even smaller once you start to try to look for evidence that would meet our increasingly stringent standards for causality. Okay, so I think that the main motivation for wanting to study cities in developing countries is probably because urbanization is coming to developing countries. So we know that there'll be somewhere around 1 billion new urban dwellers by 2050 in Africa alone. Now, I want to highlight another, so that's a large number of people, and if we're not studying them, we're ignoring those people. Partly, this increase in urbanization is going to be because of climate change. I think that's something we also want to talk about, and maybe cities will be places where people seek refuge from climate change, and that refuge will be more important in developing countries. So this means it's a good time to think about cities. So then I thought I'd talk about, well, what are we missing, and what does it look like to try to study cities in developing countries, and what does it mean to combine urban economics with development economics? So I think there are very good reasons to ask this question, not only because of the questions that are interesting in this domain, but also because if you're a young graduate student, there are good opportunities here. So when we combine different fields in economics, we often come up with very interesting literatures and good career success. There's the micro foundations of macroeconomics, which has led to several Nobel Prizes. Psychology plus economics has led to Nobel Prizes. Labor plus development, again, Nobel Prizes. So I thought I'd think a little bit about what is a field in economics, and therefore be able to describe urban economics and development economics. So for me, a field is a core set of questions. At this point, it's also a core theoretical answer to those questions, and then some sort of sensibility, the culture that determines what it is that is interesting research to that group of people. And along with Gilles, I agree that it's largely on these sensibilities and cultural differences that urban and development really, really differ. So what is urban economics? Well, urban economics I see as being driven by the sort of main question: why do people live and work in dense locations that we call cities? And I think the core answer that's provided to that is that this is a city is a tale of two externalities. The first one is the advantages of agglomeration. That's why we come together in cities, but we don't all live in one gigantic city, and that's because of the downsides of density. When we all come together, there are congestion effects and we get on top of each other, etc. So those two forces come together. And there are two kinds of externalities, one positive and one kind negative. Finally, the sensibilities of urban economics. Well, largely these positive and negative externalities come together in a spatial equilibrium model. And modeling and that spatial equilibrium is a lot of what drives research in urban economics. And urban economics would like to know whether that model is true, to quantify its parameters, to test its predictions, etc. And this leads to a lot of research, which I think is absolutely fascinating, but tends to be what I would think of as causes and consequences type of research. So these are just questions which come from Ed Glazer's lovely Triumph of the City, but his opening remarks, he sort of suggests that these are the kinds of questions you would want. Why do the rich live and poor live cheek to jowl in our urban areas? And how do once mighty cities fall into disrepair? These are relatively descriptive, and they're not going to be the sorts of questions that development economists tend to be interested in. So what then is development economics? Our motivating question is, why are people poor, and how do they go from being poor to catching up with wealthier people? The answer that we have to that question is usually market failures are ubiquitous, and they are worse in weakly institutionalized developing countries. And that means we would like to find those market failures and we would like to fix them in some sense. And the sensibilities of development economics as it's developed over the last 20 to 30 years are really driven strongly by the sort of poor economics Banerjee and Duflo perspective on things. That is, we like to answer small questions that we can answer well. I guess Esther Duflo's TED talk from very many years ago sets this agenda. It says, we've done lots of macro things and we don't even know if they work and people remain poor, but we can genuinely answer small questions. That's led to a culture where we like experimentation. Experimentation is two things. It gets us causality, but it also allows us to look at policies that may not be existing. We like to collaborate with implementing partners, and we like to get direct evidence on questions that those implementing partners or policymakers have. And we like to work in developing countries, collecting bespoke data and getting to know the setting. And most of all, we're driven to answer questions about what would make life better for people in developing countries. That's the real goal that has come to be passed. So if you wanted to put them together, what do you have? Well, I think they naturally come together very, very well. Development economics would like to find externalities and use those, if they're positive externalities, to encourage those externalities, or if they're negatives, to discourage them, and use that to improve the lives of poor people. And urban economics tells us that externalities are what creates cities. They're the fundamental building blocks. The positive externalities of being together create productivity and enjoyment, but we have to overcome the negative externalities of crowding, the crime, and the congestion that are created. So that suggests that development economics should love to be working in cities. Relative to urban economics, development economics, though, is going to say, well, we want to improve on things. So while an urban economist might ask how strong are positive externalities of living densely, and a development economist wants to know, how do I make larger externalities from living densely, etc. These are now very, very big stakes questions. I think people are going to be moving into cities in the developing world. If we don't get those cities right, it's possible that those people are going to live lives in congested, crime-filled, and uncomfortable places. But if we get them right, they're going to be high productivity places where poor people, the current world poor people, can be wealthier and better protected from climate change. Development economics can also borrow from urban economics, and there's been a great deal of borrowing of the modeling of urban economics. The spatial equilibrium model has given a lot of development economists a way to deal with questions that they'd like to deal with, spillovers, general equilibrium effects, and those sorts of things. So then I would just want to say one final thing about the sorts of questions that come out and whether they are development questions or urban questions and how they fit. I'm just going to illustrate with one question that we get asked at the IGC by a huge number of different countries, city representatives, and that is garbage collection. And I think that markets for garbage collection potentially seem slightly boring to many economists, but I think that they become very important when you look at them as an urban development problem. So what's the issue? When we all move together into a city, we suddenly have a garbage problem. My garbage that I throw in the street is your problem. It decreases your quality of life, it decreases your health, etc. There's the externality. The question that we want to ask as development economists is, how do we cope with that externality in the most efficient way? We want to ask that because often there are very little public resources available to just pay to get that garbage picked up. Then I think there are very interesting questions around how you create a market. How do you get private incentives to come in and try to pick up people's garbage? Because there are valuable things in that trash. If we go back hundreds of years in London, we used to have a huge number of people walking around and making valuable use of the things that people dispose of. So then the question becomes, what is the least thing that we need to do in order to make it so that private companies can come together and they can actually solve this garbage problem at the cheapest way possible? So we get questions like, would it be enough to encourage separation of trash? Would private companies pick up trash if they were separated into 3 or 4 different groups that they could then use more simply? How much more would we have to do than that? And that then becomes something that the development economists can create some experimentation around and try to answer policy questions. And I think that sort of question is not one that's the traditional urban economist's question, nor is it one that's a typical development economist question. Gilles is correct, has been a lot about rural communities prior to now. So that's my introduction, and then I'll hand back to Vicky.
Thanks, Gharad. We're going to stick with you for a bit now, given that you've promised if people work on garbage, they're going to get funding for their work and Nobel Prizes. super exciting. So if you could just expand a bit on what you think the sort of interesting topics of urbanization and development are. So we've spoken a bit about waste management, but what are the other areas you would point to, looking at both the sort of evidence gaps in the literature, which is quite small at the moment, but also the questions that are really of interest to policymakers. And Gilles, we'll be coming to you with the same question after that as well.
So I guess I want to start by saying, look, I think it is the way to think of questions is just to notice that cities are places of externalities. And if there's externalities, we don't think that private markets will fix things. So there's just a huge amount of opportunities. So but here are some things that I think are key. First of all, climate change is going to be key to urbanization over the next 50 to 100 years. Here, I think we're even lacking basic, interesting descriptives. Are cities going to be great places to hide from climate change? Which cities? And which cities are not? Where are migrants currently moving to? Are they going to places where we believe they will be relatively safe from climate change? Or are they not? Within cities, we can ask the same question. Are people who move within cities at the moment moving towards places that are relatively protected or relatively unprotected? And I simply don't know even the first descriptors of those, not in a lot of developing country settings. The second on climate is we need some models to start thinking about things. For example, here's a key question around developing country cities. Should they stay or should they go? Should we try, for example, to protect cities that are already agglomerated in areas that are going to be below sea level? Should we build seawalls? Or should we try to move that population elsewhere? And how on earth does one move that population elsewhere? Does it move of its own volition, or does something need to be done? Third on climate change, and those are big, big questions. Third on climate change is we just need a whole heap of evidence on really, really small things. As I said, we get constantly asked the question about garbage. This is a really small but really important thing. If more people are moving into cities, we need to deal efficiently with their garbage, and many poor country cities don't have amazing budgets to do that. Another question that we get asked a lot is about flooding. How do we go about efficiently managing the flooding that's already started to happen in some countries as sea levels have risen? Those are great economic questions once you pose them as the question of how can we most efficiently deal with flooding. They have huge economic content and they can be answered potentially with small-scale experimentation like development economists want to do. So those are one big bunch, and I'll leave it there and I'll let Gilles have a go.
Thanks, Gharad. Gilles, over to you.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with the emphasis on climate and urban resilience. That's a huge, huge topic. I'm going to approach that slightly differently, because again, with my background in traditional urban economics, there's a temptation to look at all the questions we've been looking at for many, many years in the US and in Western Europe and bring them to developing countries. And, you know, there's some value to that. Ed Glazer have done some agglomeration studies, trying to estimate the benefits from agglomeration within a bunch of countries. I've done that in a couple more countries, and you know there's some benefits, but at the same time there's the risk of missing sometimes like some really key features. So to me, one interesting way to think about urbanization and development is really to think about what differs in developing countries relative to what we've done with traditional urban economics, but again, in the US, in Western Europe. So the first thing to me that I find really, really interesting is weak property and protection rights. There's been some work on this. I think we need a lot more. This is this world where indeed weak institutionalization, how do things work? There's a lot of really interesting things that, for instance, Harry Sellard has uncovered about different forms of property rights. How does actually those formal and informal property rights work together, and so on and so forth. Then talking about, well, informalities, there's a lot of informality in developing countries that we do not see in richer places. And it's informality in the labor market that everybody well knows about, but there's also informality in housing. The two do not exactly match. You can have a formal job and live in a slum. There's informality, huge informality in transportation, querying with Google Maps for transit data. There's whatever 1/2 of the developing world where there's basically no information available from Google because there's no formal transit. Everything is informal, and we need to know more about that. That's why there was a job market paper by Lucas Conwell this year, who's going to UCL. That's why this paper resonated so much with Gharad and with me, because this is the first paper that's talking about a huge issue. We have 2 billion people in developing cities that are using informal transit, and we know absolutely nothing about that, or we know very, very little about that. And that's a bit of a shame. So Lucas actually, yes, okay, let's go there. Let's look at let's try to understand what some of the key questions might be. Let's gather some data. Let's actually run a survey. Let's do some modeling and come up with something interesting about that. And, you know, it's a first paper. I expect to see maybe 50 papers within the coming year, because this is a huge topic. So informality in transportation, informality in credit as well, which interacts, as I said before, with housing and some other things. And really, there's all those informalities that can be studied well separately and in conjunction with each other, because I think they do interact pretty strongly. Then my day job is to be a professor of real estate. So what I find really, really interesting is this notion of partially durable construction. You know, where I live in Philadelphia, you build a new building, and this new building is going to be here essentially forever. Of course, in many parts of the developing world, there are some technologies that are not quite as drastic as the one we have here, where you go from nothing to something that's going to be here for the next 100 years. There's stuff in between, semi-durable. So I think we need to understand that better, because a lot of the cities at some point will need to be built better, will need to be built with higher specs and in a way that satisfies people, that offers them more comfort, that actually is not some areas that are entirely well covered by low-level housing, but also will offer some common spaces, also maybe space for economic activity, and so on and so forth. The last thing that I find really interesting is this notion of rural-urban wedges that has been studied more by people like David Willagakos on the macro development side. But that's really important, because that's bringing together structural change that is unique, but also coming back to traditional questions of urban economics about agglomeration benefits. So all of that, I think, are really interesting topics viewed from a really high level. But again, I think we need also to try to understand what's specific about the cities that is not happening elsewhere, because the risk by just trying to import as urban economists or methods without any sensitivity to the local context is bound to fail. So we need to be a lot more well attuned to that.
Great. Thanks so much, Gilles. I'd like to just pause quickly here to the audience. I know we've got quite a wide range of people who've joined us, both from sort of policymaking and practitioner backgrounds, as well as academic. But I think in addition to posting any questions you have in the chat, we'd be really eager to know sort of what you think are the really interesting topics of urbanization and development, maybe questions that you're grappling with yourself or that you're working on in other countries. Please do post them in the Q&A just to add to the conversation, as well as any other questions. We'd welcome those as well. Okay, we're going on to the next question, and sorry, Gilles, it's back to you. The methods being used in urban economics. So I know you did a wonderful framing of this in your presentation at the last Urbanization and Poverty Reduction conference. We might not have time to go through sort of the full array and deep dive into the methodologies, but if you could give sort of the highlights of that, that would be great.
Yeah, so there's urban economics is pretty eclectic in what it thinks is appropriate research. You know, ranging from the very descriptive to much narrower work trying to establish causality between X and Y. and everything in between. What I would like to insist on today is, we're going to talk about data well after, but in the developing world, is this we need to develop very often our own data. And our own data is a three-dimensional world, and there's a fourth dimension, that's time. So actually just collecting, acquiring data, that can be RCT, that can be scraping the web, that can be cell phone data, which I think is very, very promising. All sorts of things, small GPS trackers in buses, in trucks, and so on and so forth, possibly in trucks while collecting garbage, where to Gharad, favorite topic today. So we need, developing, thinking seriously about acquiring, collecting new data, and then transforming those data, that can be pictures, that can be all sorts of things, into data that we can try to use after that, which are essentially rows and columns with numbers. All of that are great challenges, and I think we need to think more seriously about those things. Then there's the whole, now that we have data, what do we estimate and how? Again, I think I'm really happy to see, as co-editor of JUE, all sorts of things. So ranging from people doing very descriptive work in an area where we know nothing. So, even as a referee for the American Economic Review, the first paper that offers some interesting insights, for instance, about housing finance in the developing world, I would certainly have a very favorable outlook on this. Then you need to execute well properly, of course, but so more exploratory work, I think we need to see that. At the other extreme, after RCTs, there's narrow program evaluation. And yes, there's been lots of things that have been tried, and we want to be able to estimate that. Sometimes there's no RCT, but we can find control groups, and we're in the natural world, and then we can have some discussions about, like the diff in diff between those that were treated or not, and how exactly to do that, and bring in all the latest well technologies, and Kirill Borosiak and Pedro Santana and all those things, and talk endlessly about heterogeneous effects, and all of that is useful and important. I'm also a big fan of IO-inspired type work in development, to think about both on the firm side and also on the labor mobility side. So Gharad with Melanie Morton has contributed. Alan Xiao is also working in that sort of direction, and I think it's super promising. I'm also interested in people doing more macro type modeling, to try to think more about structural change, and trying to connect it more and strongly to the reduced form, evidence that's been estimated. So all of that, I think, is of interest. Development tends to be more narrow in what it likes in terms of methods, and very broad in terms of topics. Urban is a little bit on the opposite side. We tend to be quite narrow in terms of topics, but in terms of methods, anything goes, provided it's new, interesting, relevant, useful, and well done.
Great. Gharad, any thoughts to add on that, on methods?
I agree with much of what Gilles just said. So I want to give a plug, first of all, to experimentation in general. And as I think I said earlier, I want to think of that as beyond RCTs to establish causality. And here I want to mention Gabriel Kleindler's job market paper, which I think is forthcoming in Econometrica. So we know that there are traffic congestion problems, and we know that one response to those is to charge people for driving on certain roads. But we would like to know, before we do that, what it's going to do, and that means experimenting a little bit with some small-scale versions of this. And here Gabriel designed a lovely little program on a cell phone that would subsidize or tax people for driving at different points in the day. And this enables you to estimate the elasticity of people's driving choices with respect to those taxes. It's not an RCT or a full-scale evaluation of a program, but it's a little piece of experimentation. and it allows us to understand better the world. And I like that. And I, of course, like full-scale RCTs of things. And I think there are many really small-scale questions in developing country cities that don't normally get thought of by urban economists and really are open, as I said, with my running garbage example, where we can do those sorts of things. The second is, I think there's a huge need for collaboration between researchers, governments, NGOs, mayors' offices, these sorts of people. That collaboration allows the sort of experimentation I'm talking about, but it also allows data collection to occur in a timely fashion if we know that some sort of intervention is coming along. So if I'd like to evaluate, for example, an eviction program, we have loads of different non-experimental ways to do that. But mostly I would need to know where people were living before the eviction. And if I know it's coming, then I can start to try to study these things, because often the data to do it in any other way is just not going to be available if I can't do that. The third thing is, I think there's a need to put more market failures into the models that we use to try to understand the world. And here I'm going to kind of pick on one of my favorite literatures, but be a bit critical, or maybe seeming to be. So Esteban Rossi Hansberg and Klaus Desmet have these wonderful papers on how we will adapt to climate change by moving over space. And in those papers, they tend to find that climate change is not going to be too dramatic in its costs because we're going to be able to adapt. Now, my gut feeling is that there are not enough externalities and market failures in those models, so they're planting a too rosy view of what's going to happen. If you look under the hood of some of those models and think a little bit more about the migration, I expect that there's going to be huge numbers of people arriving in cities. And we think that those people arriving in cities won't necessarily be welcomed if they arrive en masse. And that's just an example of a friction that I think is very, very real when you have mass migration over time. And more thought about how to do that is, to me, very interesting. I also think we need a lot more work on the political economy. I don't really know if this is a development issue, but it might be. So I think a lot about migration in developing countries. And then when I talk to people in government, it's just not even clear who's plausibly going to represent those people. So they come from a rural area, they move into the city, and the city that they move into is broken down into 50 different administrative organizations, each with their own political agenda and with no clear way in which to coordinate these things. Even within city, this is true. Who within a particular city is responsible for building a transportation network that may go across different borders? How should I even start to think about these questions? And I don't know. The final question, which I suppose is behind a lot of urban economics and that we'd really love to know the answer to, is, are the models that we're using, for example, to predict the impacts of transportation infrastructure, are they giving anything close to the actual answer that we see after things are built? Now, I'm putting that last because it's so hard. But I think that, you know, if anyone can do that, that would be absolutely amazing.
Great, thanks, Gharad. And maybe just quickly taking my liberties to pick up on that as a question and maybe putting that to Gilles. I think you had a slide, Gilles, in your presentation at some point about sort of modeling in urban econ. I think it had the title "Damned if you do and damned if you don't." I wonder if you can say a little bit more on that and sort of where we are on those modeling techniques.
Yes, I'm very much with Gharad on the two key points that he made, which are, to me, as an economist, there's no way I can think about the world without a model, even when, you know, I've actually done some work on urban transportation, which was really at the opposite end of the spectrum relative to Gabriel Grinder's great paper, but he went very, very, very micro. And me and some co-authors were like, okay, we need to do that, of course, but we also want to have some ideas of what's going on in terms of big picture, what are the key facts. But even when you do like key facts, you have some sort of theory in your background. So you want to have some modeling. You want to understand what you're after. You want to understand indeed all those externalities, all those forces, how they work, and make some conjectures about how to articulate them. So it's, if you don't, yes, you're damned. If you do, you open yourself, of course, to criticism. And this is the second point that Gharad made, which, yes, we have all those models. We need to really seriously evaluate them, because, you know, people say, oh, I'm writing this model and look, it works very well because they've chosen their context, because they're trying to make the case for their tool, and that's completely fine. But is that tool actually working more generally? This we don't really know, and we need to, what I'm doing also is really actually trying to collect a lot of data over long periods of time, when we can actually look at whether or not the sort of long run effects that are being predicted by those models actually work out in different contexts. So I'm working with the Asian World Development Bank, not IGC on this, but we're collecting data about urban transportation in 9 or 10 large Asian cities where the ADB is financing large-scale transportation projects, and trying to understand, you know, what is happening over the long run. And for that, we're collecting a lot of data, and then they'll be open for people to look at stuff. So this is about transportation. We're trying to get stuff from cell phone, where people live, and so on and so forth, and try to see more generally, because I think we really need that sort of evaluation. Some models, they seem to work in the cases where people study them, but whether there's broader truth to that sort of modeling, that's still a huge open question, and I really want to know about that.
Great, thanks, Gilles. So we're going to go onto the part of the conversation to talk about data now, although I think we've already touched on some of those things. I just wanted to encourage, I see there's one question from the audience, but if you can type your questions in now, because we'll be coming to those next. But Gharad, if you could say a bit on what you think the exciting data sources that researchers should be considering when doing research on urbanization in developing countries.
I might be the worst person to ask about this question. So I see huge value in sort of big data sources, but largely for asking descriptive questions. So the question I asked earlier, where are migrants going? Are they moving to places where they're in harm's way or out of harm's way? I think that can be done wonderfully with cell phone data. I'm skeptical that we'll get access to the cell phone data in the way that we need to really answer those questions. But I do think that governments have those sorts of data sets sometimes. And that sort of data can be useful for those descriptives. In many ways, however, I think that, you know, developing countries may be very different from other locations. Data is very hard to get. Data is often very imprecise and badly collected. And that means that I think that for a long time, we're still going to be reliant on data that's collected directly by researchers for the particular reason of answering their questions. I'll go back to an example of forced eviction. I've been working on this question with Simon Franklin and Sarah Winton in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And really, we're trying to compare people that are around borders prior to eviction and where one side of the border is evicted and the other is not. That requires quite precise GPS-located data and a huge effort to track those people. I find it very hard to see that you're going to be able to get that data in any way. Maybe I could get it from cell phone data, but then I'm very skeptical that I'm going to be able to get the information I want. I want to know what's happening to these people's livelihoods when they're moved. I want to know what's happening to their social networks when they move, the quality of the jobs they have. And I remain to be convinced that I could get that from some big data source. So that's my plug for sort of traditional development economists. Get yourself into the field and start collecting data.
Great, thanks, Gharad. Gilles, do you agree? Anything else to add?
Yes, I agree. One of the reasons why urban economics has been lagging and not gone to cities in the developing world is that all the cool stuff we got in the late 90s, early 2000s, all that trove of admin data, we have all those panels of workers and firms and workers and stuff that indeed doesn't really exist in most developing countries. And sometimes it exists, but it's hard to use, and there are some clear issues. Like, for instance, panels of firms and workers, it's only typically less than 50% of the workforce because there's a big 50% that is informal and not recorded. So clear limitations here. At the same time, yes, I'm with Gharad. We have going there and collecting data yourself is way cheaper than what you can do within the rich world, because labor to do that is way cheaper with those countries. So we probably want to take advantage of that on a grand scale. Given my culture, which is slightly different from that of Gharad, I'm completely cool with big data. I think there's a lot to be learned. So Gharad is calling that well descriptive, but for me, it's not a bad word. I mean, I don't think it's a bad word for him as well, but it doesn't always allow indeed to go into causality and stuff. But for instance, having some description, 3D description of cities and try to think about the gradients and how they work and what drives them. Why is this city more like this, that city more like that? All of that to us is important and interesting. So here we've had lots of things that have come our way. There's a lot of remote sensing stuff that's nightlight, daylight, and so on and so forth from satellites. A lot of cell phone and GPS pings and all sorts of things that I think, yes, we cannot always get them in exactly the way we want. It's one damn country after another and so on and so forth. But this is also something. There's a lot that we can get from the web. I'm a big fan of Google Maps. There's Airbnb that operates in some developing countries that offers some information as well, to be taken with a grain of salt, but some information. There's all sorts of apps in developing countries that can be used, that people use for all sorts of things, and that can be used as well to extract data and work with it. Google Street View cannot go everywhere in slums and stuff, but looking at Google Street View and being able to extract some information and maybe look at that over time, I think is also potentially very promising. Rich and poor countries alike, there's a trove of data in the private sector that we start being able to use. There's scanner data for grocery prices, so it's not there yet for retail in poor country, of course, but there might be other ways to look at that. We have banking data. So yes, I understand that in many parts of the world, people tend to be unbanked, but more and more they tend to use small apps where they keep all their money on their cell phone, and there's information that's there. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's come our way. And we'll be able to do more with that. So here, this is where again the tension between development and urban. We may not be, that may be just an accessory to the plot for lots of narrow questions, where indeed as development economics always tries to remove the context, whereas for urban, the context is actually what we tend to be well interested in. So there's lots of stuff that's coming our way that we can use. And again, it's fine to ask for money to go on and say, I'm going to do an experiment on this because this is really interesting. That can be garbage collection, that can be access to jobs, that can be all sorts of things. Or I'm going to use satellite data and this and that to look at patterns of urban growth over time. That's also completely okay. I mean, and everything in between.
So I'm just in response to a question. So Ashar Malik has asked a question which maybe is in response to some of the things I said earlier. So I sort of agree entirely with everything Gilles just said, and maybe I put the point too strongly. We're going to use a lot of big data, and we're going to use cell phone pings, and we're going to use apps, and these are all wonderful. My general impression is I think that people think that might be all we're going to need. And my main claim was we're probably still going to need on-the-ground data collection for a lot of things. And Ashar is asking, he says, evaluation of large-scale urban projects requires a large sample size. Does this call include an analysis of secondary data to demonstrate the impact of urban development programs? Of course it does. If you can demonstrate the impact of a large-scale urban program using secondary data that you can get access to, that's of course absolutely wonderful. And I didn't mean in any way to say that you have to be collecting your own data to be relevant in this area.
Great, thanks so much for picking up on that question, Gharad, and Gilles for representing the big data sources as well. I think there is someone said there's another question coming through from Facebook, so I'm hoping that will come through on the Q&A or the chat shortly. But while we wait for it, just one quick follow-up question on sort of administrative data at the city level and the use of, so that's on one hand, and your experience with that, and then the use of census and sort of household or firm survey data from sort of national statistics agencies. Often it's hard to get hold of those or get hold of those at a sufficiently disaggregated scale. So I don't know if you could talk about your experiences getting access to that kind of data, which I think can also be quite useful in some of these applications. Gilles, I don't know if you want to go first.
No, I can go first, because Gharad emphasized the need to go on and collect your own data, be in the field and organize the data collection, which actually I recently did with some money from Vicky in Kampala. So that's really useful. But the other reason why you want to go to the field is also to meet people locally. And from time to time, there's this person in a meeting who's going to tell you, oh, but for the last 20 years, we've been doing X, Y, and Z. So it's happened to me on a project trying to think about well congestion and collect data about well congestion in Bogota. The first thing I got was a local well travel survey, which was really helpful to go beyond Google Maps, because I actually knew when people were traveling and from where to where in a survey that was actually reasonably well done. And then I also discovered that they were doing some work looking at traffic at major intersections, and so that data was not always very well organized and stuff, but that was well in the meeting in Bogota. Somebody told me, oh, but we've been doing that for 20 years, and we're doing whatever 50 major intersections, and we're counting the number of vehicles over 20 hours of the day and types of vehicles. In some cases, we even have some evaluators that look at how big the buses are, how full they are for transit, counting counting the motorcycles, like something that took one of my research assistants, who I think is online today, and me maybe a year to pass out, but there's a lot of data that was extracted. And I think, that's one of the key benefits of actually going there, is that you end up talking to people, and from time to time, there'll be some treasure that will have been hidden that comes to you. Of course, the work is not completely done. I mean, I'm still trying to finish that paper, by the way, after many years, but, things that are really helpful, and actually being there, talking to people, it's not only about publicizing your research and trying to make it useful, but it's also understanding what goes on locally, and from time to time hitting the jackpot in terms of, oh, this is really a really important source of data that could be coming my way.
Great.
I agree with everything Gilles has just said. There is data available. It requires quite a lot of effort to get it, and that effort is very rewarded and rewarding, and that's a very good reason to be on the ground. Here, I'd also like to just give a shout out, I guess, to Sam Asher and Paul Novosad and other people who do similar things. Sam and Paul have been putting together an amazing data set in India, very painstakingly, and making it all available online. And I think that sometimes, that's not necessarily well rewarded, but people need to do more of that. Once you've done all this work to get this amazing data, it would be wonderful if more of that was available in a well-organized way, online and easily accessible to researchers. So that's to be encouraged.
Great. And maybe just to say on that note, I think IGC, that is something we're going to be considering in the next call for proposals, is some of these proposals on, simply data collection efforts, given that it is so important to the sort of ongoing nature of the work that we're doing. We've got 4 4 more questions, but I'm going to bucket 3 into one question for you, Gharad, in the interest of time, around the link between urban development and climate change. So I think one question says, is there interest in economics to understand the role of policies that extend access to amenities such as electricity and water, as well as human capital upgrading, for example, training agricultural workers to move to cities and join urban labor markets? And another question that's related is, what kind of interventions could be undertaken to address climate and urban development nexus issues and challenges? So that's on the climate side. So Gharad, I'm going to let you tackle that one. And then Gilles, there's a very specific question to you. I like this question a lot. What is a research question that you have wanted to pursue in developing countries, but data has been a hindrance? So those, I think, are going to be all the questions we have time for. So if you could each take those, and then we'll wrap up. Thanks.
So there's just a sea of things that we need to know around climate change in cities. I take the first question to be a little bit around climate migration and whether it's worthwhile helping people to move from rural areas to urban areas. I think there's a huge amount of work to be done there. We need to understand whether people are making the right choices around the timing and the locations where they're going, whether there are different programs that help migrants prepare to move into cities, at what time those programs should be given. We also desperately need to understand what can be done to ensure that the move of people into cities is not conflictual. If some of the projections are correct, we're going to see historically large migrant flows into developing country cities. And my concern is that that's going to lead to political and conflictual issues. And we need much more research around trying to understand that. But, you know, there's a million other questions around climate change and cities. From my view, there's some possibility that moving people into cities is going to help with mitigation efforts. But my own personal view is what we should be interested in developing countries is adaptation. How can movement across space and cities help people in developing countries adapt to the change that we know is coming? Developing countries aren't really responsible for climate change, and our main effort should be trying to ensure that the impacts of climate change are minimized in those countries.
Okay, Vicky, you want me to go for the last
Yes.
minute?
Thanks.
That's actually a pretty hard question. So to actually build on what Gharad just said, when people move, I'm also interested in how much they learn when they move. And there's a big issue in the developing world where very large cities are wages are typically much higher than in second-tier cities. And the second-tier cities, they lack economic dynamism, whatever that means. And to me, this is about perhaps the fact that the most skilled part of the population really agglomerates in those very, very large cities and don't move back and forth second-tier, first-tier cities very much. I would like to be able to explore that hypothesis. I've been meaning to do that for many years. And yes, I need data for mobility. Tracking those externalities is really hard. And I don't think I'm there yet. Jorge de la Roca at USC is making some progress on those issues, and this is great. But yes, this is really hard. But what I've also discovered is that it's not always about lack of data. It's also because the question sometimes I'm not quite sure what the question is. So let me go back to this notion of urban resilience. The question was brought to me and to many others at the World Bank for many years. Okay, why don't you do research on urban resilience? And I'm like, yeah, but I understand it's a really big set of policy issues, but I'm not quite sure how I should be articulating those questions and what I should be researching. Because yes, we could be researching stuff that is more like consulting, but we're economists, so we want to do something that's actually not consulting. Everybody has a different job here, and we should try to articulate academically meaningful questions, and that took time. Now I'm I'm starting well to see the light on that after many years, and thanks also well to the work that many others will have conducted. Here I can flag maybe the work of Guy Michaels and Ferdinand Rausch, who started, I think, in the right sort of direction, and then okay, maybe I can do that. So now I'm developing with the World Bank with a project on urban resilience, where we're trying to understand indeed what happens to urban transportation or to transportation between cities when there's flooding, whenever there's extreme weather events. That can also possibly encompass rising sea levels, but really try to understand how big the disruption is, how long it lasts, what are the alternatives, how much of a role plays, the fact that you have a pretty dense road network, which environmentally will be wrong for some other reason, so we'll have some other negative effects. But when stuff happens in one particular part of the network, actually when it's reasonably dense, you can go around it, and maybe where the cost is not too high. So now, I mean, I'm starting to see what the questions are, and developing the tools to answer them. I mean, it's a big project that's going to take several years, but usually it's data, but it's also more, I think, way more important being able to frame the right question that really matters. And this is hard.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on, or at least food for thought, I think. We are 2 minutes over time, always running over. But I wanted to say a really big thank you to both Gilles and Gharad for the really interesting discussion today. Also to the audience for the really brilliant and insightful questions that you've posed throughout. Before we all go, I just wanted to sort of re-emphasize our call for proposals, which is opening on the 29th of September. As we've sort of spoken throughout this session, we are interested in funding pilots, exploratory research, full research projects, as well as data collection efforts that respond to some of these key themes of interest in the urbanization space, particularly in the countries that IGC works in. But we are willing to look beyond that if the question is interesting enough and can be applied to IGC context as well. So please do have a look at our website to get more information on that, and do follow the links in the chat as well. I'd also just like to highlight the a call for papers to present at our next Urbanization and Poverty Reduction Conference taking place at the World Bank in DC in early March next year. If you do have interesting papers that you'd like to submit to that, we'd really welcome those as well. And I'd also like to say, if you could take a moment to follow us on Twitter, both to keep up to date on our latest activity, but also for some very entertaining insights on urban economics from our very own Oliver Harman. And very finally, a reminder about the feedback survey. If you could take a minute just to fill that out so that we can use your feedback to continue to improve our webinars and events. But with that, very sorry for running over time. A big thank you to our speakers and to our audience, and hope to see you again soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much, Vicky.
Thanks, everyone.